In this video, I'm going to discuss the types of anxiety that I've had to face in my life while also living with PKU. Hopefully you watched my first video in this 3-part series that's focusing on this topic. Now, I am going to cover kind of the 3 levels, how I've categorized them anyway, of anxiety that I've faced in my life. There are other forms out there. There's other categorizations for different types of anxiety. I'm not covering them all. So the first one, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but essentially I've categorized it as normal anxiety, right? The anxiety that we face in our everyday life, that's part of our life. It's the feelings and thoughts that we get maybe where we're preempting something that's come in and it makes us kind of nervous. Again, I'm not going into different types of anxiety like maybe social anxiety or PTSD or any other condition that's linked. I'm just talking about it from my perspective. I see normal anxiety as just a part of life. There are times in our life, depending on stress levels and what we're doing, we cope better and maybe it's not a part of our day. But actually there are other times when it is, depending on what we're doing, obviously. I'm not going to focus on this type. We're going to move on. Type 2, PKU anxiety. Or, and let's just categorize it as anxiety linked to the PKU condition. I never thought about it this way, but well, prior to this anyway. But if we look at the first video, if you've watched that, then I talk about this kind of link between the body's creation of dopamine and serotonin and how the high Phe levels act as a blocker in our brain to then stopping those chemicals filtering over the blood-brain barrier and having an impact on us in a positive way, because they do. As chemicals, they have that positive effect and make us feel different, make us feel better. So the high Phe levels makes anxiety in our bodies much higher. My experience of this really I can link to when I was on the ciprofloxacin trial. I don't think, no, that's probably not true. I was about to say I don't think I've really suffered with PKU and anxiety. That's got to be absolute rubbish. I would say maybe in the later part of my life it's not been a factor. I've been able to kind of cope quite well with the diet, thankfully. A lot of that largely is because of the tolerance I'm on, and I'm really thankful for that. I've no doubt experienced anxiety with the condition many times. I'm thinking of kind of knowing when you're going out to restaurants and kind of having to pre-plan, but I don't think I ever had it massively. I don't ever think it was a ginormous factor in me living my life. I've always tried to do things. It probably was maybe when I was younger, in my kind of late teens and early 20s. That was probably when it was probably at its worst, I would suspect. However, in adult life, it's not been an issue. But the ciprofloxacin trial, as I mentioned, that was one where it definitely brought it to the forefront of my daily experience. So when I started the drug trial, the first week my Phe levels dropped quite quickly. I didn't know this at the time actually, it was only through learning later and reflecting back too. I realised that the drop in Phe was so rapid because the drug had had an impact. Again, so grateful that it did. But that drop meant that the chemicals in my body, I'm assuming, were just kind of a bit, chaotic and, establishing themselves. But I remember feeling very, very happy and ready to be on the trial. My diet was in full control. I was in a really strong, good mindset. But this anxiety built up in here that I had experienced before, not linked to PKU, but linked to the next chapter that I'm going to kind of mention, the third type of anxiety. So because I'd gone through that, I knew what was happening this time around. It felt the same, but it was about something different. And the different was the drug trial for PKU, and I felt really good about it. So I didn't understand why I was experiencing this, and it was, I think, because of the rapid drop of Phe. So it just shows that sometimes there are influencing factors that have an effect on us that we feel like we don't have no control of. Now, the diet is clearly one of the major factors, I think, in kind of this production of these chemicals that can impact and have a greater impact on our anxiety. So I think actually figuring that out enabled me to realize there's going to be some times in my life where I'm not going to be able to fully control it, and there's going to be some times when I am going to be able to fully control it. And I found that empowering because I realized that on those moments when I can't control it, like it was a drug trial, and I was being told that actually this isn't really a side effect you're experiencing, I realized that it wasn't me. It wasn't me that I was struggling. It was the chemical reactions in here that were changing, and the change is what I was feeling. So I found that quite empowering, and I don't know why I feel like I need to share that. Maybe it'll be useful for someone who's on the drug trial, maybe it's useful for someone who's going through anxiety, etc. But the one thing we can control, and it is controlling the controllables, is attempting to control the diet. Harder for some, easier for others, fully aware of that. But it does have an impact on our anxiety level. Number 3 then, the next and final one, is what I would classify as medical anxiety. And it sucks. For me, it was linked to not PKU, it was actually linked to cancer. So 6 years ago, 6 years? Yeah, 6 years ago, was diagnosed with cancer, had to go through a round of chemotherapy and had lots and lots of hospital appointments. And look, I never want to go through that chapter in my life ever again, and I never want to wish that on anyone. The cancer that I had was kind of in stage 1, exceptionally well treated, and the outcomes were really positive. And long may it remain that that's the case, and long may it remain that my experience is now gone in the past. When you're in it, any medical condition, and you may experience this maybe with other conditions that you've got or other circumstances or whatever it might be. But for me, it was, you're in this cycle of living in the moment, and the moment's pretty crap, yeah? You've been told that, in my case, it was cancer. So I kind of was in a bit of survival mode, right? I'm living my life, and you're experiencing it, but you're not necessarily processing it. That's the word. I felt like I processed it later, after. It's that caused the anxiety, amongst other things. The anxiety for me was once I'd been given the all clear. Isn't that crazy? It's mad really, isn't it? But that's the effect it can have. And for me, what I realized, I was hospitalized for anxiety. They called it stress. Looking back, it was clear actually, I just didn't know it at the time, that I was being checked up all the time. I'd been released from hospital, I'd been given the all clear, and I had been told that for 10 years I would have to be checked up through clinic appointments. For the first 5 years it would be quite heavy. It would be scans, blood tests all the time, and they were a yearly occurrence. But what actually happened was, within the first 3 years, I was pulled back in for constant checks, constant scans that weren't part of the normal annual process. And it was because I was told, keep an eye on your body. We need to make sure that everything's okay. So what happens is you start internalizing your thought process, and you start looking inward and external, looking for things. And that then definitely for me increased my anxiety level, right? Because if you find something, you're like, what the hell's that? I never noticed that before. You mention it to the doctor, you're in. And for me, the fortunate thing was I was in quite fast, and they would get me in, and I would have scans, and you have to wait maybe a week for results, or you'd get the results there and then. But whatever it is, it's the waiting game of expecting the worst. Now, luckily, that chapter's gone. I had to work consciously quite hard to overcome that. And it wasn't just my efforts, it was the medical efforts of the professionals and the technology that could do these checks. So that's what I classify as kind of medical anxiety. There's definitely this thing called white collar or white doctor, the white coat syndrome of going to hospital and having that anxiety. And I've suffered with that in the past, actually, thinking about that, even though they're actually there to help us. But from my experience, it was linked to the trauma of going through the process of cancer. And so I categorize them slightly different. The normal anxiety we face, the PKU anxiety, where actually it could be linked to chemicals that are not transferring over the blood-brain barrier. There is obviously another anxiety that we could categorize in there in terms of just living life with a very low tolerance and trying to survive in this world when you're not allowed to eat most of it and you have to pre-plan everything from every trip to every holiday to every out, you know, going for lunch, whatever it might be. And then the medical anxiety that maybe is linked with a condition or whatever it might be. That's how I categorize them in my head. What I would like to know is if any of you have experienced this. Has PKU and anxiety kind of gone hand in hand for you throughout your whole life, or has there been chapters of your life where it's maybe higher and lower depending on your age, or maybe what chapter you are in your life? And have you also experienced this medical based anxiety that I'm mentioning? You know, it might not be linked to cancer, it might be linked to something else. Has there been anything there? If you don't mind putting it into the comments, that would be super useful. But I think for me, you know, it's about, it's been a whole process for me trying to understand this and this, you know, and this anxiety that I've had and why I was going through it and what it meant and how I could kind of get out of it. And for me, how I've kind of looked upon this now is that I see anxiety as if it's not PKU anxiety, where it's linked to chemical imbalances, most information and research and topics and people talking about it won't talk about that. They won't talk about this PKU, you know, crossover of dopamine, etc. They'll talk about dopamine and serotonin, but not in that way because we're really rare, right? We're a population that practically doesn't exist for most people. But what they will talk about is this state of, if you're present, there's less risk of having anxiety. Anxiety comes from, and I kind of believe this now, actually, thinking about it much more. Anxiety seems to come from either reflecting too far back and thinking about past that maybe is a traumatic moment. That was me in cancer, right? Also, reflecting too far forward in the future with an expectation that something might happen or something's coming that's gonna alter my current state. So being in the present is incredibly important, but they're just words, aren't they? When I was in cancer, you tell me that, you know, be present, you'll be less anxious. It's just not going to happen. I find it quite empowering knowing that actually they are chapters and it doesn't have to be like that forever. It's all workable and it's all changeable. And so if at any point in the future, in the past, or now you're experiencing this, I feel like it's a chapter that doesn't happen forever. It's just a time frame, and there are things that we can do that will have a positive impact. I'm going to go into those in the third video that will be highlighted on this screen somewhere. I hope that's useful. It might just be verbal diarrhea. Hopefully not, but hopefully me just kind of sharing my experiences kind of help. I hope so. I had to consciously look at things and say, right, I needed to categorize things because it was happening to me, right? So how I responded to that was incredibly important. If I just sat back and just let it happen, it would have been overwhelming, and it did. That's exactly what happened, and it was why I was hospitalized for stress. It was when I came out and said to myself, okay, these are all the things that all the information out there is telling us that helps reduce anxiety. I need to categorize them, and more importantly, knowledge is not enough. I need to take action. And I think that's it. It's about the past, it's about the present, it's about the future, but it's also about taking action. I feel like that was the biggest change. It was as soon as I started to actively change was when I looked at and researched something and said, oh, you know what? Exercise kind of helps. Take action and do it. So if this is kind of interest to you and I'm making some form of sense, feel free to click the next video where I'll discuss kind of what I've done to kind of mitigate all of this and be in the current state that I'm in, which is actually pretty good. I'm kind of happy. Who knows? Obviously this stuff may return, anxiety may return, etc. It's a normal daily emotion. Maybe future drug trial, I can't even talk, can I? Maybe future drug trials may bring those feelings back because of a chemical imbalance, who knows? But at the moment, I'm good. And that's down to the conscious choices, behaviors, and actions that I've made that have led to this moment. And I am going to talk about them in the next video. So come along for the ride.